Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, people across the world, and welcome. This talk is part of the regular seminar series for the Centre of India and South Asia, CISA. My name is Anna Morecambe. I'm co-organising events this year along with Bharat Venkat. And our director of the CISA is Akhil Gupta. I'd like to say thank you to Akhil, to Bharat, and a big thank you to Jamaica Villegas, who has been doing a ton of work to make everything run smoothly. So before introducing our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the traditional land takers. The Centre for India and South Asia, CISA, at UCLA, acknowledges the Gabrielino Tonga peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavanga, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hanuk Vetam, ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, andEu Hinkam, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Neelam Raina. It's absolutely wonderful to have you. And before we go into your talk, I'd like to introduce Dr. Raina. She's an associate professor of design and development at Middlesex University in London. And she also works for the United Kingdom Research and Innovation UKRI as the challenge leader for the Global Challenges Research Fund's Conflict and Security Portfolio. So this is a huge 20 million 5-year project, a hub working in many places across the world. So Dr. Raina really spans the world of academia and development properly, rather than being a sort of, well, I mean, a lot of academics do applied work, but this is this level is very unusual. Dr. Raina has led several funded research projects which examine material and social practices through which Muslim women in conflict areas reproduce themselves on a daily and generational basis, and through which the social relations and material bases of capitalism are renewed to understand both the costs of conflict and the connections between vastly different sites of production. So she connects creative home-based workers who are in what are largely seen as peripheral areas to larger notions of peace building, countering and preventing violent extremism, poverty spirals and conflict theory through culturally significant, socially relevant practices. She's also worked in Kurdistan and southern Iraq, and she's had decades of field experience, beginning in Kashmir, which is her initial site. So she looks at notions of healing, trauma, peace, and reflection through embodied practices of making, using material culture and traditional knowledge as underpinning for approaching violence and peace building and sustainable income generation that in turn could contribute towards socioeconomic reconstruction and post-conflict development. She has studied in the UK and India. She's got a PhD and Masters in Design and Manufacture from De Montfort University in Leicester. She has a postgraduate degree in textile design from NIFT, the National Institute of Fashion and Technology, I think I'm right in that, in New Delhi. And she also did her undergraduate degree in history at one of the Delhi University colleges. She's been a visiting fellow at the LSE, Centre for Women, Peace and Security. She's an editor of the International Journal of Traditional Arts. And she has a new book coming out, co-edited with myself, Creative Economies of Culture in South Asia, Performers and Craftspeople, which we hope will be out perhaps next year. And she serves on strategic advisory boards, research think tanks, of multi-donor projects, as well as on advisory boards of development aid projects. So very unusual academic to span this sort of work down from very grassroots craftspeople in this kind of creative work to this level of development work. So Neelam will be talking about exactly this in her talk. So thank you so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to this.
Thank you for inviting me, Anna. Thank you to everybody in UCLA, and thank you especially to Jamaica for running around with the hundreds of slides that I have sent across. I'm not going to introduce myself. Anna has done a very lovely introduction. I'm going to jump straight in. So I must say, still haven't got used to talking to a screen. The work that I'm talking about is going to take you through a journey, and I'm going to tell you about the journey in a minute. But what I would like you to do, if you were in a room with me and this was in a giant hall, I would have asked you to think about one thing you own or cherish, which is not necessarily of financial value, but for emotional reasons. I want you to take just 30 seconds to think about something that you really like or cherish, which might have been given to you or you bought for yourself or how you've inherited. And if you can't think of one thing, I would ask you to think about something that your mother, grandmother, any relatives, women relatives in your family could make that you can't make. It could be food, it could be crochet, it could be anything else that you think they could make well, that you can remember, but you know you can't make it. And if you can't think of a thing, I would ask you to think about a language or a phrase that you haven't heard for a long time, because it is a generational thing. Or if not that, I would ask you to think about an image that comes to mind when the word traditional is being mentioned. This could be dress or food, a house, a home, a road, a street, a shop that you remember going to as a child, to look at things and see if it is linked by a dotted line to a woman who introduced you to it. We are coming to the idea of what traditional means and what tradition is. It's very difficult to define, and I have tried to capture some definitions that make sense in my head. Tradition is anything that is historic and usually consists of personal memory that is of value to you and or is recognized by some others with who you share an identity or a trait. It is visually or orally distinct and of emotional value. I remember recognizing somebody wearing a traditional Kashmiri dijahar, which is a sign of marriage, on the London Tube. I had no idea who she was. I had no idea where she was going, but it was her identity that was captured in her traditional clothing or jewelry in this case that made me realize that she is the same as me. So that brings us to what is culture. I think culture is again one of those things that kind of sits between heritage, culture, tradition. You can kind of seamlessly float between the three. And it's difficult to define culture, but if you had to introduce yourself physically to somebody sitting next to you in this room or to somebody else on this screen in Zoom, how would you introduce yourself to someone from the opposite side of the planet? What will you tell them about yourself? What will you tell them about where you're from? Usually you will go back to things that, again, go back to language, food, art, time of the year. What do you do on a full moon, spring equinox? What do you do to celebrate Thanksgiving or Christmas? What have you been usually doing that you have seen others doing that form part of who you are? Coming to traditional knowledge, I'm trying to get rid of all the definitions so I can throw some visuals at you in a minute. Look, this is the UNESCO definition of traditional knowledge. Local and indigenous knowledge refers to the understanding of skills and philosophies which societies have developed over a long period of time. I'll give you a half a second to read this, but what is key and what should jump out of this is the fact that all these things that we define as things that we can sometimes touch, sometimes hear, sometimes smell, are things that we always hold dear to us, and they are part of what makes us culturally diverse and provide a foundation for everything that is locally appropriate and can be used for thinking about sustainable development. So what will happen in this lecture for the next 40 minutes or so, I am going to bombard your senses. I'm going to make you read at the same time as look at images and at the same time as listen to me. And I want you to start rolling with it and to see where you go with it. So I always struggle with identity introductions. Anna's given me a really nice introduction, but when I meet somebody and they say, where are you from? It does trigger a lot of questions about who am I? I'm Indian, but I'm British. I'm an academic and I'm a researcher. I influence policymakers. I'm Kashmiri from the Indian side of Kashmir, but I'm also Hindu. I can just keep breaking my identity down into microscopic pieces till I reach a point where I realize that I am the first Indian born in a family of people who were born in Pakistan before it became Pakistan. So I'm first generation born Indian. My grandparents and parents were refugees from Pakistan when Pakistan was made in 47. And I'm married to an IDP who's also Kashmiri from Kashmir, who moved from Kashmir to Jammu. So how do I introduce myself without unpeeling all these layers of who I am? And then I have a British born Kashmiri who's downstairs who will probably pop his head in a minute. Through this lecture, I will walk you through across different time zones, across different spaces and places. And I am going to introduce you to women who carry vast quantities of tacit, uncoded knowledge within them. They are from various cities in various countries. And the common thread that links them are their gendered identity, their religious identity, and the fact that they live in politically fragile and sometimes also environmentally fragile spaces. That is the commonality across the places, but these environmentally fragile, financially fragile, politically fragile are very neat categories of fragility that are usually stacked in layers, posing challenges for women, which we shall explore in a minute. But for now, let's also remind ourselves that the women you will see in these images are extremely resilient, sometimes in quiet and inadvertently in silent ways, sometimes also absolutely resilient in the face of extreme danger and uncertainty, and determined to get through the ugliness of every day that violence brings to them. Over the past 20 years of working in this field, I have met some intimidatingly scarily resilient women who are very committed, very dedicated, and scarily ambitious as well. All the limitations that I place upon myself from working from home in the last 1 year of the pandemic are things that they have lived with for the past so many years of their life. And it's interesting how they seamlessly do this without being thrown by the interruption that children pose. So we will begin in Indian Kashmir, as Anna said, and we will walk through the conflicts in Kashmir, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan. And I will show you a whole series of images that show you where we are going. So we'll cover why women want to join craft making, which is where the initial thinking started from. We'll look at women's status in traditional societies and how the expectations imposed and expected of women of a certain age and category are very, very steep and unique to fragile spaces. We'll look at traditional societies and fragile spaces and what they were like before they became conflict affected, and look at tacit knowledge and traditional roles of women. But we then also look at the challenges that they face because of their identity. So where are we going? Here's a long list, starts with Indian Kashmir and Jammu, moves to Kel Tabat, Azad Kashmir, and then it moves to Pakistan, in Quetta, Rawalpindi, Charsadda, Swat, Laspur, Kargil, Muzaffarabad, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and then in Afghanistan, we are working in Kabul, Kandahar. In Sri Lanka, we are working in these 4 cities, Kandy, Colombo, Batticaloa, and Mannar. And I have also done some work in Kurdistan and Iraq, in Samawa and Erbil. When I say I, it's a difficult one for me to digest, so I shall instantly put this out at you. None of the things that I'm going to show you, none of the images that are here are my images. Most of the work that I do, it has always been very closely co-produced, co-designed with women in different parts of the world. It generally starts with conversations and then pushes through to everything that they want to do in the longer term. And so we provide needs analysis of what these women need. And then we also move on to providing bespoke research that leads to training that the women need. But all of this work is joint ownership. None of these images are only mine. None of these images I will take credit for entirely. Some of them have been shot by me. Some of them have been shot by colleagues and friends and researchers who are part of the team. So all of this is joint work. This is not my work. It would be wrong for me to say this is my work over the past 20 years. This is our work. And we consist of lots of different types of women who are listed here on your screen. Women in these spaces have precarious lives that are challenging in any case because of who they are and where they are. And when you throw in a conflict, it makes it a little bit harder. My research in Kashmir indicated that the number of women involved within craft making had increased exponentially during the intense violence during the violence in the city and the late 1990s to early 2000s, women formed the craft sector as labor force. They had joined in huge numbers under various categories of production. So women were joining the slightly long chain of supply that makes crafts. Let's flag here the fact that in Kashmir, we are known for making pashmina, walnut wood carving, carpets, papier mâché, and a never-ending list of handmade goods. So over the as the intensity of the conflict in Kashmir escalated, numerous women were joining craft production spaces. And it was interesting to me to see why that was so and how they wanted to benefit from joining this and what was influencing this decision to join the craft sector. It's well known, and the UN gender thematic assessments have proved this again and again, that in conflict affected fragile states, the political, social, and economic role of women shifts from the domestic to a public space. And this is where we are at in most of the conflict spaces. The research that is built around communities and knowledge is research that takes into account the visual and material cultures of regions to understand the shifts that the conflict creates in subtle and not so subtle ways. We use a cultural mapping methodology to explore how communities of women across different conflict contexts operate and how they are relying on coded and tacit knowledge to rebuild their lives. The tacit knowledge, which we will come to in a minute, is core to who they are and what they do, and is extremely important to understanding how they are going to rebuild their lives. Some images from different parts of the world will show you how we are reaching a point where there are lots and lots of women in very many spaces. This is Indian Kashmir. This is Indian Kashmir. This is not a woman, but she was happy to show me how he did what he did. And she was watching him very closely. And within a year or so, she was making what he's making. So what is it about these women that makes them more important enough to be discussed at this point of time in the day? In traditional Kashmiri society or traditional societies, and I don't think this is specific to Kashmir, women have been independent and protected and educated, but have very rarely worked outside. But, and here's where the skill set comes in, they are wholly responsible for domestic decision making. So from everything from household chores to, what is going to be clean, what is going to be washed, who's going to cook, what is going to be cooked, who's going to buy which vegetables, when, what time. Very obsessed with food, most people are in these traditional communities. And I admit I'm one of them. They are also responsible for caring for the young and the old and the ailing. They are also responsible for travel plans. Where will the family travel to? Are we going to go meet my relatives? Are we going to go meet my mom? Are we going to attend the wedding of this distant relative who came for my son's wedding? All these decisions are taken by the women. They also decide if they are in the position to, whether they will pay the domestic hired help, who they want to hire, who does that person who comes to clean my house report to. They also decide who's going to wear what. So they will buy clothes for the family. They will buy the soft furnishings in the house, curtains, carpets, cushions, dishes, serving dishes, all kinds of decisions. They will also go as far as arranging suitable marriages for their children or their relatives' children or their cousin's daughter. They are very good at matchmaking for suitable matches are being made all the time, and they are constantly surveying who's the right age and who looks like a good person and who's well brought up. Constant judgment happens. They also plan weddings. They also plan funerals. They are also part of the rituals of the everyday. They also contribute to understanding what they want to say for what purpose in the family. And they decide every single thing that happens in the house pretty much, right down to serving portions to the family, food portions to the family. In a traditional Kashmiri family, the oldest woman in the house will serve your food for you out of love and affection, and I think in brackets certain degree of control, but they will dish out food for you. And if you want a second helping, they will give you some more. And they generally tend to overfeed you. But the the role of the older woman in the family or the older women in the family is built through all these younger women who are training under her to how to take decisions. But they have taken key decisions about education, about health choices, about who's going where to get the wound stitched up, and how, you know, what you're going to drink when you have temperature. So it's an interesting bunch of things that they are responsible for, which creates leadership skills and decision making skills and tacit knowledge and ownership, all these things that we go for training to in our different institutions that we work in. But their interaction with strangers are limited, but everything else stays in place. And this is where we are at a point where we realize that these women who, when they're out of their house, out of their local domestic setting, appear to have no skills. And at one point of time, I remember asking them about what skills do you think you have? And of course, they said, I can't read and I cannot write. I can count, but you know, I don't have any skills. And then you ask them, you know, so who decides what you're going to eat at home? Instantly, the decisions come tumbling out, followed closely by moaning about the men who do nothing in their lives. So it's their own perspective on themselves that makes it quite interesting to see that they are responsible for quite a lot, but don't always accept the fact that they have responsibility thrust upon them. What would be useful at this point would be to kind of point out that traditional societies have a almost binary system of expectations where self-appointed moral and religious vigilantes are always usually actually men, while the expectations from women are always pile steep of what is expected as acceptable behavior in terms of dress. Are you dressed appropriately? Are you dutiful? Are you polite, caring, pious, obedient, well-behaved, mindful, soft-spoken? And then it circles back to how well you were brought up. If you don't meet those boxes, you will be judged, or your mother will be judged for not raising you properly. So it goes round and round. But at the end of the day, women are seen as bearers of cultural history and traditional knowledge. And it is that created a route to self-reliance through income generation in conflict spaces. What is interesting here is to note the fact that women and leadership are things that in the developed world we are talking about at quite some length. There are things in the UK called Athena Swan. There are all kinds of other initiatives that encourage women in leadership positions. But very often we miss the uncoded knowledge or the tacit knowledge that is inside these women in even not developed spaces, where they are able to take decisions that influence the lives of everybody around them. And they are able to take that burden and walk with it, but it's almost effortless because it is so subliminally present in their everyday. In all of my work, there have always been children, as I mentioned. There's one sitting here on the table, writing on some things. And so I put all of them in one image. And these are various kids who have been present in research workshops at various times. The boys in the corner, all of them are under 16, I think. And it's just effortless. The ability to multitask is embedded within their ability to do anything that they want to get done. And it is unusual for us in COVID's lockdown spaces working from home to think about this, but this is usual stuff in inverted commas. So women seems to be the almost responsible for transmission of culture, which is interesting to understand from the perspective of the fact that each role that they play within the domestic sphere makes them into absolutely perfect consumer behavior audience. So for craft working, it was interesting for me to see that they were very discerning customers when consumers during the conflict and actually before it, where they bought and gifted, they were buying things, they were gifted things, they inherited things. They recognize and understand the nuance of design. They can look at a thing and say, this is nice, but it's very new. Design is not nice. This is not traditional. or they will look at something and they'll say, it's nice, but it's too expensive. And they know the price variations in the market quite well. Sometimes they're also quite able to judge a product by saying, this is very nice, but it's not made here. I can tell you it's made somewhere outside of this region. They understand the difference between handmade and machine made. They can touch a thing and tell you that this is not exactly silk, or this is not pashmina, or this is not wool. They have all these deep understandings of things around them that make them who they are. And interestingly, and I think Sudha Kaul has written a very interesting book about this called The Tiger Ladies. And she talks about the shawl wala. The shawl wala is the seller of shawls who will sell shawls to you at your daughter's wedding. And then when she goes to her in-laws' house, will also go there to check on her and also sell her some shawls. But when things go not so well and times are hard, she will sell those pashmina shawls or those expensive shawls back to him in exchange for money. And he will keep that secret. He will not tell her parents. But the parents in traditional societies are not allowed to visit their daughters' married homes. So the craft network of people who sell metal bowls, or they will come and reline your copper pans and pots, or who will sell you carpets, are also people who carry knowledge and information and news networks with them. And it is this absolutely ingrained mesh of people who are connected to each other while with their material and traditional practices that make these places very, very, very interesting to me, but also make you realize that what we see as art and craft in the developed world is not the same as craft, because craft is a living, functional entity that plays a role across your life in traditional societies. Women in Afghanistan were talking about, in Kandahar, we got research back that told us about how every girl under the age of 13 at some point of time has learned how to make charma dozi and khamak dozi, because I think it was khamak dozi actually in Kandahar, that they learned inside each other's homes, as public spaces are not exactly open to women in Kandahar to wander around in public spaces. But we found that craft was something that built these roots for people to talk through and chat within the confines of their homes, but also teach each other. So peer learning, yet another concept of education in the developed world that's peddled around quite a bit, is an obvious thing that they do and they know how to do quite well. So the transmission of knowledge between generations of women is something that is not new to them. And it's interesting to see that. Khamak dozi in Kandahar is almost an identity version. Any girl who's over 13 will know khamak because she would have been taught by the women in her house. And in Sawat, we were hearing about women who would use embroidery or the need to do embroidery as a reason to leave their house, where they would sit together under a tree or in the sunshine doing some embroidery, writing their names on handkerchiefs and dropping them off on their way to collecting water, where the notion of romantic conversation and romance and fiction, non-fiction romance between two girls and the whispered giggles and the songs that they would sing are all part of who they are. It sounds amazingly romanticized and idyllic, but till last month it was still true. It is not imposed in any way. These are observations from the field. What is also useful is to remember that women have always observed the men who make these goods as bystanders. They might have helped in spinning some yarn, they might have helped in loading a loom, they might have cleaned wool, they might have carded the wool, and they might have done spinning in the night in preparation for whatever needs to be made. They have been constant observers, and this also adds to their ability to join this sector of work. So why women are important? We understand how crafts are embedded within their lives, but how does this work in fragile spaces? In fragile spaces, the reason why women decided to join conflict across the places that I listed in the earlier slides has got very many reasons. Work using traditional knowledge means they are part of the landscape and the ecosystem from which these traditional knowledges emerge. Working from home ticks the childcare box, which you can do from home. In violent spaces, the safety of the indoors is obviously of prime importance. A lack of pressure to go to work and be with others who might be strangers is reduced from working from home. Religious expectations of duty of care within Islam are met by being working from home. Working from home is also low investment in transport costs or travel costs on a daily basis, and any travel related anxiety or stress. There are very few viable options for income generation in conflict spaces, and it's very important to remember that craft becomes one of them very quickly. But also craft is one of those things that requires very low investment in raw material and absolutely minimal infrastructure, if any at all. Crafts are also embedded within the landscapes and ecosystems, and raw materials that are environmentally friendly, sustainable, sensitive, plays a significant role in the emergence of creative practices that form the traditional knowledge within communities. Relationships with landscapes, changing seasons, beauty of the land that is within them is reflected in their practice, aesthetic and functional value of these goods. And in marketing parlance, it's said that users make better producers or design better objects. Already present structures are there for making, at least in these traditional societies, local markets, bazaars, festivals, open spaces that they can go and sell their things at. And I will pause here for half a second to remind ourselves of why in COVID lockdown, working from home has been, well, at least last year, seemed like a welcome surprise and pleasure. And all of those reasons apply to craft as well. So coming to understanding fragility, we have to remember that high levels of institutional and social fragility exists in all these spaces. We have extreme violence. In these places, conflict is measured by the number of deaths that happen during conflict. They don't always count the number of people missing, which is still weird, but we know that by 2030, about 2/3 of the world's extremely poor people will be living in fragile conflict affected settings, and that conflicts drive over 80% of all humanitarian needs. We also know that when you stack the challenges of the conflict with climate change, rising inequalities, demographic changes, new technology, and illicit flows, you make a stupendously impossible barrier to progress that you could get to, or extremely challenging environment to exist in. We also know that in conflict, women are marginalized, they are excluded even further, and any peace processes. But coming to the peace building aspect of it, which is an important part of my work, or has become an important part of my work, coming across women who are peace builders, who are put forward in the peace processes, included in the conversation around, expected to negotiate, expected to mediate, and become cornerstones of peace building, are increasingly present and increasingly heard about, yet they are seen as carriers of community values, but they are not valued as importantly as the men who are religious leads or religious heads, which is not surprising, but it's something that links the two sectors of work together. Women with tacit knowledge who understand what's happening in their community, in their environment on a daily, weekly basis, are also those who can hear the rumblings of violence, of the mobilization towards active violence, and they've been listening to this. Yet, when it comes to peace building, we have not arrived at a point where the table is not just using women on the table as a tick boxing exercise. Some of the people who we have worked with or are working with currently are also linked to women who are countering violent extremism, who are generating income to build their own capacity to influence change and be agents of change themselves. And the agency that is derived from generating income plays a huge role in how they are perceived and accepted in their societies. Mothers of radicalized youth, wives, sisters of radicalized youth, have the ability to talk at a level that people listen at. And these women are key to fighting and pushing back on extremist ideologies and have done a stupendous job. There's a huge network of women who have dealt with ISIS. They have been, community values are being held up by them, but they've actually gone and confronted and stalled two factions within the peace process. And they have kind of pushed the peace process forward and jumped in the middle and stopped people from fighting. The peace building, human rights defenders aspect of women's lives is rolled well into the crafts that I have been working with. It's an interesting mix of extreme responsibility, extreme pressure, and yet the resilience of these women in these spaces has been stupendous. It's almost intimidatingly stupendous. Their ability to engage in this image in front of you, not all of them speak the same language. They're approximately from the same region, but all of them make different things. And they were very quick to learn from each other. Before I could talk about the peer learning aspect of the research, they had done it. They had taught each other and moved on from there. So women are especially important to fragile spaces because of the traditional knowledge that they carry with them, but they are also specifically important in fragile spaces as key stakeholders, is a horrible, horrible word, as key stakeholders for rebuilding, reconstructing, and building peace. Inequalities that have been exposed by the pandemic make us understand the reality of what level of this inequality exists. But as technology drives change, as illicit flows go up and down with the pandemic moving around these countries, it's a horribly fragile space to be in. And yet in all these spaces, all the women you have seen today continue to work and operate and continue to have ambitions of rebuilding, moving on, and moving one step at a time. I will not labor under the entire body of work that exists about how women play an important role in development, how women's employment contributes, teach a woman to fish kind of logic. I will not dwell on that. There's enough about that you can read about or hear about. But every woman who chooses to do this because of all the reasons of tacit knowledge and the role that fragility plays in their lives is important reminder that any progress made towards any of the SDGs, we have very little time to hit them, but any progress we made from this point on, where the pandemic is seen as a portal by Roy, is a point where we have to understand the role of knowledge, but also the value of knowledge that is embedded within people, that they hold dear, that defines them, that makes them who they are, and that they are proud of. It's very important to understand the limitations that these women live with and the choices that they make on a daily basis. That makes us realize that they are miles ahead of us when it comes to understanding who they are and what they do and where they want to go. These are images of tools that they have used, very traditional things. And I shall let you think about what you have just seen and heard. And I welcome any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neelam. That was just wonderful, really expansive and incredibly well collaborative work, and just so beautiful, these things, and how just, I don't know, we tend to read about conflict zones in terms of being problem areas. That's the thing, when you're reading the news, listening to the news, it's all about these sort of problem areas and deaths and explosions. So, I mean, seeing this kind of work going on and all this persisting and this resilience is just amazing. Have we got, I want to open it up though. I mean, there's many things I could ask, but open it up to our, anybody has any questions, please, you can put a note in the Q&A or write a question in the Q&A. Any question about the talk, this specific talk, or Neelam's other work in all these areas? Kashmir, Kurdistan, so many places. And what we can do is if you have a question, we can put your video on and let you put your video on and your mic on. Any questions? People are still digesting everything. Well, maybe I will then start off. So you've worked across so many areas. Well, Kashmir, Indian Kashmir, Azad, Pakistani Kashmir. India, well, obviously I know a lot more about India than the other places you've worked, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, but India has a specific relationship with crafts in terms of the whole freedom struggle. So I'm just wondering, do you find a particular receptivity in terms of from government or on the ground in terms of projects involving crafts in India versus other places? And I also wanted to ask you a bit about, I mean, in India, it's a kind of trope that, silai ka kaam, a bit of stitching work is the solution to all, especially moral problems. So I work with performers. I've been working with disreputable performers, bar girls, disenfranchised courtesans. So it's like, give them some silai ka kaam, stitching, everything will be fine, rather than actually being able to earn a livelihood from there. Anyway, so it's a sort of, there's this kind of moral thing, and it's also, that can be quite kind of low level. So a girl dancing in a bar who's earning good money, compared with earning, I don't know, 1,000 rupees or less doing silai ka kaam. So it can be, that can be a sort of rather inept kind of development, very moralistic, or using that sort of activity as a kind of excuse for, yeah. So I'm wondering if you're having to kind of negotiate that sort of thing at all, in order to do really proper, very robust, very grounded projects on crafts. So 2 questions.
In the answer to the first one, I think India has one of those, as I moved out of India to work in other countries, there's always been this looking back and looking up at India and the crafts there. As such big markets, so much support. But despite the huge numbers of people employed in the sector remains an informal sector. It's still those who work in the sector work in the sector. There are some committees, there are some commissions, some awards, recognition, but it still remains a debatable area to work on for income and dignity. Those two, despite the freedom struggle that triggered the use of Swadeshi and the valuing of, everyone make their own things. But it's a extreme situation where the institutionalization of craft didn't quite take off at any point of time. It still remains bits and pieces happening in lots and lots of places with a huge number of people working in it. But still it remains quite informal and loosely put together. None of the craftspeople I've ever worked with have ever wanted their child to become a craftsperson. There's a lack of dignity associated with craft working that does not shift. If you run a craft business where you are not actually making, so you're not the labor, then it's different. But if you're actually making stuff, you're not seen as an artist or a designer as you would be in this part of the world. In terms of the trope of the stitching and the silai ka kaam, I have seen lots of places where I have been, where there are lots and lots of brother machines, sewing machines being stacked up, 25, 30 machines that have been delivered by some project, and they are never used. So the idea of stitching goes back to the idea of the good girl, of the expectations of, if she's a good girl, she'll know how to embroider and cook and stitch. And that moral solution no longer works. I don't think it is a solution to provide infrastructural help without providing the business models or the training required and the market connectivity to any project. The projects that I've worked on so far have always been driven by somebody in the city or the country asking for things to be done for them, and then it is built that from that point onwards rather than imposed as why don't we try this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of, and more besides. Thank you. That's really interesting. We got some other questions now coming in. Akhil Gupta has a question. We got Harinder Sandhu, Behroz Shroff. So I think let me start with Harinder Sandhu. Can we, if you'd like, you can speak your own question. Jamaica, are you able to invite Harinder Sandhu to, or I can speak it out for you.
Thank you.
I can see the question.
Oh, lovely.
So I was actually wondering that, I mean, you yourself have moved from one society to another. And when there's a migration happens, if it's not in a non-traditional society, if you move, you know, from your home state to another state and to a non-traditional space or to a non-traditional job, and what happens when immigration occurs, I mean, I know that I speak to a lot of my friends and women of my generation.
Okay, I try and answer your question. I think I lost your sound. In terms of immigration, I'm starting to wander into the space of internally displaced people and refugee populations, where there is what they carry with them as people, as their culture and their identity to a new location becomes even more precious, because it's all that they can hold on to and all that they want to value and transmit further. So in many ways it gets contained, but I haven't done much work on displaced migrant workers just yet, though a huge part of the project that Anna introduced you to is covering that. In terms of skilled migrants or people who have moved to a different location because they have moved to a different job or a different city where non-traditional spaces, the value of identity starts to go up. You will recognize those who are wearing traditionally made clothes or are making traditionally cooked food or serving on traditionally made dishes. That recognition, that tacit knowledge remains embedded. You carry it with you wherever you go. And then it becomes almost an automatic response to a visual or a trigger that makes you remember what you remember your mother making or your grandmother making or cooking or wearing. And that tacit knowledge doesn't dismantle. You might not put it to economic use or to professional use where you will rely on it for income, but it doesn't go away.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Behroz Shroff. Behroz, please, you should be able to unmute yourself and also put your video on. If you'd like, it'd be lovely to also see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful, rich presentation. My question deals with the peace building efforts of the women. I would like to know a little bit more about that. And is that work much more situated in Iraq, or is it in Kashmir as well?
The peace building network, which is called ICANN, of which I am part, also there are women in security leadership. There are different networks of women who are peace builders who live in these spaces and work in these spaces. Some of who are partners on the projects I have run and are currently working with. So it's not limited to Iraq. I think there are like 63 countries in which there are members, but the peace building efforts of the women in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, and Kashmir are the current focus of my work. The peace building is linked in many ways to the ability to build dignity, the ability to generate incomes. In Kashmir, in Indian Kashmir, there's a concept of half widow, which is a woman whose husband has disappeared, but has not been buried, which means that there are issues around adoption or remarrying or legal inheritance and all those kind of things, which makes them almost destitute very quickly because they're stuck in no man's land, and they're called half widows for quite a few years actually. When that kind of level of degradation or you know, of the burden of expectations degrades you, that space is now known as a space where there are triggers for violence, where there are triggers for a lack of dignity, which triggers violence and violent acts. These women have observed a lack of dignity, and they have observed men, young men, unemployed youth, those who have been in interaction with security forces or uniformed personnel in these spaces being insulted, degraded, and that triggers the point where you want to pick up arms, you want to join the conflict, you want to contribute to being an active conflict, active violent person. Those observations that they do by constantly being awake and alert and, you know, recognizing every little shift in their community allows them to understand the root of a conflict. Therefore, as peace builders, they are absolutely fundamental to understanding what works. They are able to change people's mind, they're able to transform conversations, they are able to understand what's going on. But the dignity that working in areas that generates livelihoods, and that ability to push back on cash transactions from different violent groups that can change your life, that dignity associated with livelihood is important in these projects and this work. The efforts of peace building are now starting to get recognized by different networks, but these women who build peace are the front line, first defenders, first responders kind of women who will respond to every single thing that happens in the community and protect their own and others. So the peace building efforts are across quite a few spaces, not just Iraq.
Thank you.
And Akhil, we have a question from Akhil.
Yes, thank you very much, Neelam, for that talk. That was wonderful. My question had to do with, I was wondering if you could say something more about the larger circuits of distribution and marketing that these products are embedded in, so that what happens after these products are made, like what kinds of capitalist, do they enable certain kinds of capitalist, practices or markets to emerge, and who benefits from them? And, ever since the lace makers of Narsapur, we're well aware how domestic production inside the house is imbricated in large transnational capitalist markets. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that relationship with the products that these women make inside the home.
Giving me a twisted question. Nice. I like it. The largest circuits of distribution are again broken down by traditional society. So some of the images you saw of those balls of wool are people who make things for exchange and gifting only. They don't sell them. They are made for the community and to be gifted within the community networks only. So there is no capitalist commercial value to these, but there's a huge amount of value to the knowledge of making and expertise. I can make this better than the 13-year-old in my house. And that kind of value exists. So the projects that I'm working on, I have worked on, don't force capitalist structures or ways of doing things that are unknown to the environment that they are in. But on the flip side, so those people continue to exchange, but very often then the desire to do any training is driven by can you show me how to do this? Why can't I learn this? I think I can try my hand at this. At one point of time in Azad Kashmir's network, I had taken printouts of Armani and Gucci couture and Dior couture, which is extremely complicated beadwork. And I took these magazines and they ripped out the page saying, I think I can do this. I was like, sure, why not? So it's the desire to learn, which is not always attached to a commercial value sometimes. But on the flip side, in some parts of Indian Kashmir, the training has been specifically saying, we know we can't make pashmina. We know we can't embroider the same way as men, but we think we can make, tablecloths or duvet covers or throws because it's thicker, cruel work embroidery. So we know the competition and we don't want to enter that competition, but we think we can do this. You think you can help us? So each aspect of training starts from traditional knowledge, but doesn't always land up in markets. The project that is funded by GCRF is allowing us to build a commercial angle into it, where the South Asian network wants to explore the ability to create a South Asia brand of conflict-based crafts. Not my idea at all. It's their idea. They want to explore it. They want to see how they can launch this. So they want to think about marketing and entrepreneurship skills. They want to understand how they can sell their goods, how they should price their goods, how to build a business. Again, different set of skills that they have asked for that the project will push back at them with, and then they can take it where they want. We provide connectivity almost between two different ends. So I know the marketing brands, big houses that would want to buy into the social enterprise aspect of it. And then we know the people who want to drive the social enterprise story and reach out to market. So I connect and then I step out of it because it has nothing to do with me once the connections are made. So those who desire access to market are connected. Those who wish to measure wool, and I don't know if there was an image, one of the people in Laspur who makes carpets was measuring wool by around their wrist. And when they were told to measure it in a weighing scale, they said, no, we know how to do this because we know this is right. So don't introduce this weighing scale business to me. So there is, I wouldn't call it resistance because there is no convincing. It's more of an observation driven mapping methodology that allows us to see what they value and understand why, and then work with whatever they want to do rather than impose ideas.
We have a question from Suzanne Hanchett. If you'd like to, Jamaica, if you'd like to invite her to put on her video and mic.
I'm sorry, my computer had my question was about cooperatives. You know, Sewa in India has done some work with women's crafts cooperatives, and I'm wondering if there's any of that in the populations you've worked with.
Yes, Seva in India is also known as Sabah in Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, which is a South Asian home-based workers alliance. So a lot of my work in Azad Kashmir has been through the Sabah network, which is Seva in Pakistan. There are quite a few of these cooperatives around. And when we can run a project that can piggyback and not reinvent the wheel by connecting up with these cooperatives, we do. But very often, more often than not, there has been a conflict of interest or a falling out of people who run these cooperatives within the networks of the communities, and then they don't want to have anything to do with each other. So we don't try and force them. So when they get along, we piggyback and kind of link up through the networks that exist. There is in Pakistan, there's something called the Benazir Income Support Program, which has huge networks of women working on crafts across most of northern Pakistan. So we have connected with them in some places, but in some places they want to have nothing to do with this. And in conflict affected spaces, the context changes very quickly. And it's very important to be driven by the context rather than previously existing networks.
What kind of things come up that make it hard for them to work together?
What kind of things come up? I think everything from government-driven policy where the state actors are not trusted, to the change in management where people are not trusted, to burnt fingers where they work with somebody who then asked them to make all these things and then they never took them and never paid them. So it's everything. And then there are all these people who come to reinvent the wheel or, you know, rejuvenate crafts and breathe back life into them that they are so fed up of. You know, the craft is not dead. But some brand fancy designer walks in and says, you know, I will show you how to do this. And they are extremely proud people. So they don't like being told what to do.
Thank you. It was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or there's something I would like to ask, but please, other questions from our audience. All right, then I will ask the, the first time I heard you talk, which was now a horribly large number of years ago, but I think you're focusing on Kashmir and the men who went missing, the men who would have been doing the crafts, who did, that was their job. and how women stepped in and started doing this male role. So I'd love you to speak about that a little bit, and also I don't know, the sort of reactions to, you know, women doing men's work as much as they are, or they're doing it in a way that is still acceptable, or are they doing it in a way sometimes which people are a little bit, you know, dubious about, this isn't quite right, or because of course, you know, with conflict and so many men go, you know, as you've been kept saying, the context shifts very, very quickly once you're in conflict and crisis. So things which were not okay before can become okay, but then perhaps not everything. So I'd love you to speak a bit about that.
Okay. Just to acknowledge the body of work that exists, there is a body of work that emerged initially from Sri Lanka in conflict. It's called the household heads concept. Women-headed households is a whole sector of work in conflict areas where default setting allows women to become household heads very quickly within conflicts. But in terms of understanding women entering male-dominated roles, it sounds good when the World Bank says it. But what happens is that the expectations of women, driven by religion sometimes, where they are expected to be within the house, they are judged for leaving their children with somebody else, or leaving their children in a creche or a nursery. And they are judged for not being available for the elderly in the house. So they know that society will judge them the minute they step out to earn an income. But on the flip side, they will also be judged for not looking after their family because they have no income. So it becomes a little bit difficult in that way. In terms of the need to work and the dignity attached to the need to work, even in developed societies, those of us who believe in conspicuous consumption, who choose not to work because you don't need to, becomes a status symbol. So those who need to work as women in these spaces are automatically joining the bottom of the social hierarchy by saying that I need to go to work, I need the money from this. I think there's also something to be said about the limited mobility of women in conflict spaces, where their choices of gaining formal employment are slim because of their self-agreed numeracy literacy skills. But their ability to leave a setting and move somewhere else to find a job that pays is extremely limited. The conflict will not allow them to move, and the family will make it very difficult for them to move away. And also you need a huge amount of resources to move cities or villages even. So that makes it difficult. In terms of understanding the fact that during my research, I found that women who had actually stepped out of their comfort zones and moved from Indian Kashmir to Delhi even to sell their wares were judged for the actions of their husbands. So if their husbands had joined a terrorist outfit or had been, shot in the crossfire, their dignity is attached to the dignity of the husband, and they are judged even though the husband might be dead for being a terrorist wife. And those barriers exist and are very blatant. Currently, with the current situation in India, I'm sure there'll be a lot more blatant than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But that judgment call prevents them from going further. But they are very aware of the fact that as Kashmiri women, they are going to be perceived differently when they move somewhere else. And this applies to Afghanistan as well. The women in Kabul have different freedoms compared to the women in Kandahar. And when women from Kabul go to Kandahar, they realize the extreme restriction on movement of these women within public spaces. So again, the mobility is limited by the political presence and the security settings of the region. And the same thing applies in Sri Lanka as well. Maybe not that extremely as Kandahar, but the women in the north of Sri Lanka have different expectations from society, has different expectations from them than from the women in Bati, which is southeast in Sri Lanka. So the role of men that go missing are replaced because they have been observers and have tacit knowledge, because they have no choice and have to step into those shoes, because it's the easy choice to make because of mobility settings, because they know the networks that those men knew. So there are numerous reasons for them joining it. In reaction to the household headed situations, household head, and then Catherine Brunn has written quite a lot about this, and Dateba has also written quite a lot about this. Jobs after war, which was developed by the concept by the bank and ILO, were focused at skilling up women in conflict contexts who had lost their male counterpart, whether it was their husband or their father. And household heads that are women have a different footprint of what the household does in a conflict context as the conflict becomes 10 years past, 20 years past. How they evolve from those households is different from men, but I'm not an expert on it, but I have read about it quite a lot. Within conflict settings, these household heads evolve in a different way around society, and the traditional expectations don't shift. The expectation of society for a woman to be able to cook traditional food while she works in a Marks and Spencer t-shirt factory don't change. So it's a rub against the modern capitalist structures and traditional societies that creates a double whammy.
Thank you, thank you. That's, yeah, incredibly interesting. I could keep asking lots more, but I shouldn't. We should let you go at some stage. Has anybody else got any questions? Please, you can put it in the Q&A. Okay, I'll just ask one more question. I'm grilling you as chair. Does any of this link into fair? I mean, fair trade is a thing. It's what a sort of brand, if you like, a thing, or it's also a concept. Or are you connecting into that sort of thing? Or I mean, I guess things have moved on vastly since fair trade first started, which was what, the 80s or something, was it, or even before? In terms of this sort of, well, following up on Akhil's question, I guess, you know, how, because, yeah, I mean, you can sort of hook people into trade, which may be then very unfair and exploitative.
Fair trade is a concept that is waiting for is going to wait for another 6-8 months. We had initially thought that we would connect up because fair trade is operated nationally as an idea. There's a fair trade office in the UK, there's a fair trade office in India. The fair trade as a brand recognition is very useful as an idea. There are faults with fair trade, but some of them are not as enormous as working for Gap. So it is a useful idea. We had thought that we would make inroads with fair trade associations for this commercial facing project at the GCRF Gender Justice Security Hub to see if we could link up as we create a brand presence or we create a category of products. And then COVID pandemic kind of changed our plans. So it has been put on the shelf for a little while. But the core driving principle behind fair trade, which is paying the price that the maker asks for, is a fair trade concept. But what is missing in this work or in this piece across the board is the fact that a fair price is not something women know how to do. They always automatically underprice themselves. They will not understand that their time is of value. They don't always factor in the fact. They will add up the raw material costs and any transport costs that they might have incurred because that comes out of household budgets. But, you know, I spent 8 hours making this or I spent 28 hours making this. They don't see their time as money. So the fair trade concept will require quite a steep learning curve within training for them to understand that time is counted as money in capitalist structures. So we are not there yet, but I am not sure if it will go down very well. Because if we do put a fair price on some of this work, and I don't know if you saw, there were images of very fine embroidery. There was a slide with very long portrait shaped photos. It's Khamaknozi where they pick up 3 lines of the warp of the fabric and embroider over it and then pick up 3 more. So they will count every thread in the fabric and then go on to the next one. It completely kills your eyes and takes absolute painful hours and bright daylight sunshine to do. If we apply a fair trade concept on that, that product will be extremely expensive, which is fair according to me. But there is no way that these women will go with that price. So there will be a bit of a debate whenever we do this.
Interesting. Yeah, all sorts of implications. monetizing time. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, if we've got no more questions, then I would just like to thank you very much. It was just wonderful, hugely expansive, vast amounts of decades of experience at you know, very, very different levels, you know, the kind of level you're working now and all these interrelated projects compared with, I guess, when you were doing your PhD as more sort of individual researcher. But it's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you everybody for coming, and stay safe and well, everybody. And this is the last, this is the last of our winter quarter talks, but we have a whole lot more in the spring, so we will be emailing people about them. Thanks so much, everybody, and thank you, Neelam.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.